If we could turn, please, to your response through your private office, then, to the submission that we looked at before the break, WITN 5494034. This sets out what you wanted, so that you, I think, in turn could provide information to the Secretary of State. Brief history of patients being infected, any payments made to them directly, setting up of Macfarlane Trust, how it was decided what finance should be provided, same as above for Eileen Trust, same as above for Skipton, attitude of government of the day, how to respond immediately to request for apology to victims, how to respond immediately to give more resources to Macfarlane and Eileen Trusts, how much, how to take forward consideration of other recommendations. And then you say this: it is clearly not acceptable in such tragic and unique circumstances for DH to claim no liability and no more money to trust. So that was your response at the time, having read both the Archer report and the submission that was being provided to you.
Yes, could I just ask you, was this directly my response to the first report, or was it my response to because there were a number of submissions? I think it was my...
So if we just pick it up in your statement, if we go to WITN 5494001 and go to page 60, you're setting out there the text of the initial submission from Rowena Geacock, which we looked at before the break. And then if we go to the next page, you then refer in paragraph 390 to some handwritten annotations from your private office.
Oh, yes.
And then 391, you can
Yes.
say, I can see from a handwritten file note to my private secretary, I asked for more information.
Yes.
So as I understand it from your statement and from the chronology of documents, this is your response to that initial submission.
Yes, I accept that. There's some toing and froing and you're perhaps going to explore.
And then we can just, perhaps if we also look at just some handwritten notes from, I think it's your private office at WITN 5494115. We can see we've got in the left-hand corner, proper report ASAP, what's in place to never happen again, advice to ministers at the time, and then towards on the right-hand side, the second entry down, when or why has MSPH not been kept informed, and then much clearer how much and why fund, and then there are some other notes. And you say in your statement that captures the frustration you felt and also your desire for better information at this point in time.
Yes, this isn't my...
no, this is your private office.
This would have been a discussion between myself and my private secretary. I presume this is her note. Yeah. Okay.
And so if we then turn to DHSC 5017972, if we go to page 4, this is an email from your assistant private secretary. The date's on the previous page. We don't need to go back to the previous page, but it's 25th of February 2009. And we can see that your assistant private secretary has essentially drawn together the points that you've set out in your handwritten note to her, and says this. MSPH has seen this report, is very concerned about the contamination of NHS blood and blood products during the 1970s and 1980s. She's particularly concerned about how this issue has been handled. The Minister feels it's clearly not acceptable in such a tragic and unique circumstance for DH to claim no liability and to give no more money to the trusts. She's asked for the following work to be done by 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. She's asked for a list of ministers responsible for blood policy since 1970. And then there are a number of requests for further information set out, essentially reflecting what we saw in the handwritten note. And if we can just go to page 3, there's then a follow-up email of the same date from Morgan Smith. Dear all, in addition to my previous email, could the note for MSPH to send to Secretary of State also include her requesting approval to speak to former ministers regarding this issue? Now, what was it in particular that led you to want to speak to former ministers?
By former ministers, I was referring to ministers in previous administrations, i.e. prior to 97. And in making that request, I thought at the time that I would get a better understanding if I knew how they saw it, the sequence of events. As you probably know, the convention is that ministers can't ask for policy advice, but there was a huge amount of information already in the public domain, and I thought that might help with my understanding of the events.
As it turns out, I don't think you ever did speak to former ministers. It's not entirely clear on the document trail at a slightly later stage, I think, comes to an end. Do you have any recollection of...
Just a moment. You're agreeing with that. You didn't speak to former ministers. That you shook your head. Unfortunately, that doesn't go down in the transcript.
No, my apologies.
Don't worry about it. I'll try to pick it up.
I did not get the opportunity to speak to ministers from previous administrations.
And do you have any recollection of why that was the case? Did the requisite approval never get provided, or do you not recall?
I think the documentation shows that no such note appears to have been produced, and at some point there was a reference to officials doing something. Forgive me, I can't remember, but there was no such note produced when I had the documents presented to me. For preparing for the inquiry, I didn't see that request. My recollection is that it was put to me that I couldn't do that.
Now, you received then a further submission on the 26th of February in response to your request. It's at DHSC 5034285. And then if we look at the first paragraph, it says this: the report of Lord Archer's independent inquiry published on the 23rd of February is critical of the speed of response of the NHS and government to threats of contamination of blood and blood products with HIV and hepatitis C in the 1970s and 1980s. We do not accept all his criticisms, but official documents do show problems at various times in the development of UK capabilities for manufacture of blood products. And in 2001, a judgment was made under the Consumer Protection Act in favour of 114 claimants who'd been infected with hepatitis C after receiving an infected blood transfusion. In his judgment, Lord Justice Burton commented that the UK could have introduced screening or surrogate tests for hepatitis C earlier than it did. And Baroness, that's a reference to the judgment I referred to before the break. And then paragraph 2 says, you've asked a number of questions in relation to the Archer report. We respond to each of these in this submission in the order in which they were set out in the commissioning note. In some cases, we've not been able to provide a full answer in the time available. And then if if we go towards the bottom of the page, paragraph 4 says, you may want to note the following points in particular, which we suggest you may wish to discuss with Secretary of State. A statement could be drafted expressing this government's regret at the events that occurred and the consequences for those affected. Legal advice is that this can be done given the length of time that's passed and the fact there's been litigation during that period. A number of anomalies exist in the 3 schemes set up to provide financial relief for those infected and for their dependents and carers. For example, in relation to the conditions under which widows of those infected with hepatitis C become eligible for benefit, Lord Archer's recommended that these be addressed, and an intention to review perceived anomalies could be announced at an early stage ahead of the government's substantive response to the report. And then top of the next page, we're consulting widely across the department to collect the necessary information to enable a consideration of all the options in Lord Archer's report. And then there are a number of sections to this briefing dealing with the range of different issues that you'd ask for further information on. I'm not going to go through each of them, and your statement very helpfully details chronologically all the various documents and exchanges that you've seen. But if we go to page 11, this is in relation to the request for an apology to those affected. And it says this: MSPH has noted that these events are being described as a health disaster and has asked for advice on whether the government can acknowledge this and apologise to those affected for what has happened without an admission of legal liability. Advice from the department's solicitors is that the term health disaster is too strong a term, as if the available blood products had not been employed, patients may have died even earlier than they did. They suggest the term a tragedy for those affected, as these patients suffered appalling health consequences in circumstances no fault of their own. Now, I've just been asked to explore with you what's said in that second paragraph that I've read out there. The advice that the term health disaster is too strong a term, and the explanation. First of all, did you feel health disaster was too strong a term to describe what had happened?
I didn't think it was too strong a term to use in the normal use of the language. No, I think that was my view.
And then the explanation for it being too strong a term that appears to be given is that if the available blood products had not been employed, patients may have died even earlier than they did, which appears to be a suggestion that haemophilia would have killed patients earlier than HIV and AIDS. Do you recall whether you were struck by that or had any thoughts or concerns in relation to what you were being told there?
I think that information was provided to me in other documents, which we haven't referred to today, and certainly that was a proposition that was put to me, yes. You're right, I think there are other documents which talk about that and talk about the idea of best available treatment at the time and life expectancy of those with haemophilia. So that was the information that was being supplied to you? Yes.
Now, if we then just go to WITN 5494035, this is part of the same document, but this has got handwritten annotations on, I think, from you and others. The first is in relation to documents withheld from release, and this was the issue of documents that had not been released under Freedom of Information Act legislation, not being provided to Lord Archer. I'm not going to go through the detail of that. Again, there's quite a lot of documentation in relation to what happened. But it's an area that you pushed back on, and I think we see, is this right, your attitude at the top right-hand corner where you write, so why am I asked as Minister to refuse release when I do not know what is in the document? So you were concerned about the withholding of the documentation.
I was concerned about vouching for documentation that I couldn't see. This is a bit of a circular argument, you referred to it, and that's clearly a frustration on my part, which is these documents were before the current administration that I was in, and we wouldn't necessarily we wouldn't get access to them, and so they were being cleared through the department. But I suppose, no, let me rephrase that. I was asked to refuse to release something that I didn't have enough, I felt, information on to justify that refusal. So I was asking the department to give me more information. Why? They wouldn't tell me the content. Obviously, I've subsequently seen that because it's been released to the inquiry, and asked for a reassessment.
And as I understand it, again, I don't want to take time going through the toing and froing on this particular issue, but a number of further documents were then released following your query about the process.
Yes, I pushed back on that. My approach was, if we're releasing all the documents, then we should release all the documents without, unless we had exceptional reasons, obviously under the Freedom of Information Act. And I think you'll see at some point there's a referral to the 30-year rule as well. So I was trying to make sure that everything that could possibly be released into the public domain was.
And then if we just go to page 10 of this document, this is on the issue of options for immediate additional support to trusts. There's reference to the McFarlane and Eileen trustees having recently submitted to officials a set of options for large-scale, long-term funding for the trusts, involving sums in excess of 100 million. These have yet to be assessed in any detail. There's then a reference in the third paragraph to a review undertaken by Caroline Flint, and that's already been explored by the inquiry. And the last paragraph explains that the Minister of State and Secretary of State, and someone has written in the then Minister of State and Secretary of State.
That's my handwriting.
Were not convinced of the strength of the case made by trustees. And then there's a question, I take it from one of your officials or your private office, do you want further clarification of how these figures were arrived at? And then that's your response, yes, please.
That's correct, that's my yes, please. And I put the then because without that, it could be construed that it was the current view, and I didn't know that until I got the further information.
And then we saw from the covering minute from Rowena Geacock that there had been this draft note prepared for you to provide to the Secretary of State. And we have that at WITN 5494037. So this is a draft prepared by officials to be sent by you to Mr. Johnson. And then if we just look down the bottom of the page, just want to pick up this issue of contacting ministers. So what's been drafted for you to say is, I recommend, therefore, that we prepare a statement expressing the government's regret in the strongest terms. Subject to your agreement, I will open discussions with former ministers in previous administrations on this proposal. Now, that's been crossed out. And as I understand it, your private office has then written what we see on the right. I asked the team about the prospect of you asking for approval from Secretary of State to approach ministers from previous administrations to ask about the advice they'd been given at the time. The team were very uncomfortable about this idea, and then it's not entirely clear what the rest of that says, but something about putting you in a difficult, and then one can't read the words at the end. And then in any event, the question to you is, would you like a separate note explaining their concerns? And the answer that's been given by you is yes. Now, just to understand what's going on here, as I understand this, Baroness, the bit that's been crossed out has been crossed out because it represented a misunderstanding on the part of the departmental officials as to what you were asking for. You weren't trying to, as I understand it, negotiate with former ministers the terms of an apology. You wanted to speak to former ministers to understand their perspective on the decisions that have been taken in the 70s and 80s. Is that right?
That is correct. I wanted to. I thought it would be helpful for me to understand their perspective in the time I wasn't seeking any negotiation or agreement with them. Yes.
And then in terms of whether there was a separate note provided to you explaining officials' concerns about you approaching ministers from a previous administration, neither the inquiry nor I think your legal team has been able to identify that in any further note. So
I don't recall it, no.
Now, if we then look at DHSC 6120809, and we go to the second page, this is a email from officials within the blood policy team to your private office, 2nd of March 2009, and it's clear from this that you had held a meeting with officials to talk about the Archer report and the response. It says, thank you for meeting with MSPH about Lord Archer's... Sorry, I've got that the wrong way around. This is an email from your private office, from Morgan Smith, to officials, referring to a meeting on that day. Thank you for meeting with MSPH about Lord Archer's report into the contamination of blood and blood products. I've detailed below the action points that emerged from the meeting. I've also checked with Secretary of State's office and they've now officially received a copy of Lord Archer's report. And then we have a number of action points set out. Hugh Taylor and David Harper to go through withheld and partially withheld documents and give MSPH a blow-by-blow account. They'll also explain how the 30-year rule applies. So that's the issue you referred to a few minutes ago about documents. The blood team to report back on the following questions. Why did it take DH more than 10 years to react to concerns, 73 to 85? When did we know something was wrong? Why didn't we act? Why did it take England longer than Northern Ireland and Scotland? Have ministers apologised or expressed sorrow in the past? How is the ROI scheme going? That's the Republic of Ireland. Why did they decide to accept liability? Who claims what for the schemes and what else they claim or can claim? And then the blood policy team, so the blood team to report back on other actions, a timeline and summary analysis of the self-sufficiency in blood products report, a timeline regarding the securing safety of supply, a reassessment of the argument not to have a public inquiry, a draft written ministerial statement as initial response to report, a real case study with identifiers removed to show how the funding patients receive from each scheme assists them and what might need to be added, an idea of what money would be reasonable to give to Macfarlane Trust, Eileen Trust and Skipton Fund. MSPH has grave concerns about the long-term implications of a final settlement figure for these schemes. So just pausing there, can you recall what those concerns were, what's being referred to there?
A final figure?
Yes.
You're asking me about the bullet point...
where it says MSPH, so you has grave concerns about the long-term implications of a final settlement figure.
It would be a general point that final settlements may not be able to take account, I'm not a lawyer, of future health and support requirements. That's not something I understand in detail, but how would that be determined to support people over their lifetime, which is what I was trying to get to.
And then review of the three schemes and the anomalies with a working plan to address the anomalies in the next financial year. And then top of the next page, a report back on how discussions are progressing with the schemes regarding financial needs. MSPH wants to ensure that these patients receive fair recompense for their escalating healthcare costs. She would like to know how best to support these patients who were affected by contaminated blood and blood products. Recipients have said they prefer the Skipton Fund model of lump sum payments. To check that the DWP and HMRC are sorted in terms of support to these patients. To check with the British Association of Insurers as to these patients' access to insurance. To review the documents withheld or partially withheld under the commercial section of the FOI Act. And then additional points. MSPH will talk to Secretary of State about this issue tomorrow. She'll show him the chronology and the explanation of the withheld and partially withheld documents. She will also talk to him about the need to express sorrow and the possible additional money needed for the 3 schemes. MSPH believes that a WMS, a written ministerial statement, would be a good way to respond initially. An apology or expression of sorrow is important. MSPH made it clear that as she is expected to put on the public record that she's satisfied as to the reasons behind the withheld or partially withheld documents, she and Secretary of State need to know the exact reasons for these documents being withheld. The blood team are taking forward discussions around the financing of the 3 schemes. MSPH will meet with David Harper and Hugh Taylor to go through the withheld and partially withheld documents. In relation to free prescriptions, MSPH made it clear that we need to wait until the outcome of Professor Gilmore's review is known. So you wanted, it would appear from this, arising out of the meeting, rather a lot of further information and analysis and work to be undertaken to formulate a response to the Archer report. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, in the meantime, you then, along with Alan Johnson, met with the Lord Archer on the 11th of March 2009, and you received a briefing in advance of that meeting. I just want to go to that document next. It's DHSC 00411157_052. And we can see it's dated the 10th of March 2009 from Rowena G. Cook. It's to your private office. And then your Assistant Private Secretary has written at the top, Dear Dawn, this is the briefing the team have prepared for your meeting with Secretary of State and Lord Archer tomorrow. And then if we look at paragraph 2, we can see what the briefing covers, and there's a number of annexes referred to. And then there's reference at the bottom of the page to an answer given by Baroness Thornton in the House of Lords. And then over the page, we see the heading Government Position. The position of this and previous governments is that this is a tragedy and there's every sympathy for those infected. However, it is important to remember the following points. Now, I'm not going to read again all of these, but we can see essentially a number of the assertions that we've seen in earlier documents here repeated. The treatment given to haemophiliacs was the best available at the time and action was taken in good faith. Such treatments markedly increase the life expectancy, formerly 25 years, and quality of life of haemophilia patients. As soon as technologies, heat treatment and testing were available to improve safety, they were introduced. Evidence in relation to hepatitis C emerged over time, and the very severe long-term consequences of infection were only fully recognised by the scientific community during the late 1980s. And then there's reference to litigation and the establishment of the various schemes. Now, you say in your statement, perhaps we can put that up on screen, WITN 5494001, page 69. Paragraph 3.110, bottom of the page. You say this, having referred to the written briefing and the various, and the annex and comments about possible actions. You say this, I was extremely disappointed that the official summary of the Archer inquiry recommendations and the comments provided for response were inadequate. As the inquiry will see, the officials recommend no action on 5 of the 6 proposals, and on the Archer recommendation of more financial assistance, put reasons not to respond positively but made no recommendation. My written annotations show my frustration. None of the recommendations for action demonstrated any movement on the part of the officials to find positive responses where we could to the Archer recommendations, nor was there any recognition of the difficulties encountered by victims because of low income and pension rights because of their inability to undertake paid employment. And I think we, in terms of your handwritten amendments, I haven't got the reference for that. But in any event, you've described there in your statement your reaction to the briefing that you'd received. Do you have any recollection of what Mr. Johnson's view was at that time?
No, I don't. I can't recall that.
And then you held the meeting with Lord Archer on the 11th of March. Do you have any recollection of that meeting?
I don't have a detailed record. No, I don't. I've only got the benefit of the minute.
And the record we have of the meeting's not a formal minute, but an email which summarises the discussion. So if we just look at that, DHSC 5277959. We can see it's an email dated the 13th of March, bottom of the page. It refers to the meeting that you and Mr. Johnson had with Lord Archer on the 11th of March, and then says the following points were discussed. And then if we go over the page, I'll just pick up just a handful of these. So it says Secretary of State would need to be convinced that current financial arrangements were insufficient before he considered any adjustments to the compensation system. Lord Archer explained that many patients suffered financial hardship, but MSPH said it was important to distinguish what financial pressures were a consequence of infection as opposed to being the consequence of the illness which had caused the patients to need transfusion in the first place, i.e. haemophilia. In terms of what's said to be there, the Secretary of State's position, the would need to be convinced that current financial arrangements were insufficient, suggests that he was not at that stage minded to make any significant changes to the financial arrangements. Do you have any recollection of his perspective?
I'm afraid I don't have any recollection. You referred to his statement. I haven't seen that, so I don't know what he says with regard to that. Clearly I was of a view that we needed to have movement there.
There's then a bullet point relating to a number of discussions about other aspects of the recommendations from the Archer report. And if we just then pick it up, bottom half of the page, a bit in bold print, it says, in terms of next steps, Secretary of State and MSPH would like to receive advice on the following points. They would like to look at the eligibility criteria for those who receive money under the different schemes, including options to rationalise the schemes, which should incorporate the options already outlined on how and if to adjust compensation. What are the options for the department regarding insurance provision, including perhaps an arrangement with the insurance industry? They would like to look at the funding for the Hemophilia Society and options to give the society a wider remit. There's that request there for advice, but presumably still also the outstanding requests from the meeting you'd had with officials, that long list from Morven Smith.
Yes,
you still
that would
wanted
be
answers
correct.
on all those points.
Yes.
And so we get then to some further advice on the 19th of March. WITN 5494098. This is from Rowena Geacock to Mr. Johnson and to you. And then your private office say, Dawn, here are the team's recommendations. Regard Lord Archer's recommendations. P.S. Can you please pay particular attention to the financial relief schemes? And then we can see the minute refers to the meeting with Lord Archer. And then if we go towards the bottom of the page, we've got the heading financial relief schemes. You asked us to look at the eligibility criteria for those who receive money under the schemes, including options to rationalise the schemes. The attached annex provides details. Option 1A covers addressing the anomalies in eligibility criteria regarding the Skipton Fund, which would cost in the order of 56 million as a one-off sum. Option 1B covers rationalisation of the Macfarlane Trust and Eileen Trust, and removing the discretionary element so that all claimants have the same eligibility to relief under the scheme. Initial estimates that this would cost circa 100 million as a one-off sum. Options 2 and 3 in the annex concern increasing the compensation payable under the scheme should you be minded to pursue this. However, it's important to note that the financial relief schemes for HIV and hepatitis C have been set up on different bases. All are UK-wide, and the devolved administrations contribute financially to the Skipton Fund, although they do not contribute financially to the two schemes which make payment in relation to HIV infection. So that's the issue in relation to financial relief. There's no specific comment, I think, handwritten comment from you in relation to those, but there is a circling of the figures, 56 million and 100 million. And then the advice continues referring to the Hemophilia Society. Is that, I'm not going to read through the detail of that, but is that your handwriting there?
It is my
So you're
handwriting.
setting out your disagreement with, or comments on a range of issues in that regard. If we just pick up your observations on this in your witness statement, Baroness, WITN 5494001, page 72. And I think you summarise the position in paragraph 3.115, and then in paragraph 3.116, we get your observations. You say this submission is endorsed with handwritten observations, and then 4 lines down, Morven Smith, your assistant private secretary, drew my attention to the financial costings for the relief schemes. These were the calculations I'd requested. I circled the figure of 56 million and 100 million, which was higher than I had anticipated. And then you refer to your annotations as regards the role of the Hemophilia Society. And then you say at the bottom of the page, last 2 lines, at each point I was seeking to push the officials to provide a reasonable response rather than recommending that no action was necessary or that it was too expensive. On the question of financial relief, I did not express a view. From memory, I think I wanted to give more time to considering what could be done, but I knew that given the financial constraints the department was held within, a cost of 50 million or 100 million was not achievable. Can you assist us in understanding the reference there to the financial constraints the department was held within?
Yes, this all of this debate is taking place post-financial crash in 2008, and I can't remember the exact date, but there was a budget and public expenditure announcement, March 2009, and all government departments were under severe pressure, and spending limits had been agreed. And for the Department of Health, most of its money really goes directly to the health service. So what it has to redirect wouldn't necessarily be that great. So I was mindful myself that I needed to be able to justify that expenditure in the circumstances of the time. Our world turned down, government debt was huge. I'm not going to say about, was huge. And there were long-term problems there of committing to recurring expenditure, which the financial team did flag up to me.
And then we can see, however, you then, through Morven Smith again, continued to ask for ways of addressing the position of financial support. So if we go to DHSC 5024869, there's an email bottom half of the page from Morven Smith. It's dated the 24th of March 2009, and it says MSPH is looking for a way of giving more funding to MFT and ET, which is recurrent. However, she also wants a new trust document which does away with discretionary payments and brings the MFT and ET in line with the way SF, Skipton Fund, gives money to its applicants. I understand that lump sum payments would be preferable to the trusts anyway. MSPH is not keen on the idea of a one-off final settlement, as it's not possible to have a final settlement. And then there's reference to experience regarding the thalidomide trust. And then this, MSPH would also like to leave the idea of further funding to SF, Skipton Fund, alone at present, but with a caveat that we will review the situation of the Skipton Fund in 2014, which is 10 years after inception. Can you just help us in understanding what your thinking was there in relation to the Skipton Fund? We see that you wanted to find a way of getting some additional funding for Macfarlane and Eileen, but to leave the arrangements in relation to Skipton unaltered, but subject to a review in 2014. Why was that?
I was clearly under a time pressure here in terms of trying to get an announcement of the government response. And the question of the Skipton Fund having been set up was a particularly complex one to unpick at the same time as the two other funds. So I took the decision that I should put that on one side for now, whilst I set a review for the 10-year point. There was nothing to stop being returned faster than that, and I think you will see that subsequently. So by this stage, I'm trying to, because I realise time is of the essence, those infected and affected quite rightly want to know, well, what is the government's response? And I'm trying to get to that position whilst not closing off further considerations subsequently. So I'm trying to get together a package for the written ministerial statement, which of itself is an incredibly unusual thing to do, given it wasn't a department or formal inquiry.
We can see that there's then further advice on the 31st of March 2009 at DHSC 00411157_035. If we go to the second page, please, Lawrence. So paragraph 1 says, sorry, I should say it's from Rowena Geacock to you. It says in paragraph 1, you requested further advice in relation to two of the recommendations made by Lord Archer. And then those are set out, the first being lifting the level of ex gratia payments, etc., and then the second being about the Hemophilia Society. And then there is a discussion under the heading Financial Relief Schemes, set out what your preferred approach is, and there's a reference in that second paragraph there to, in addition, there does appear to be some discrepancy in the level of initial lump sum payments between the MFT and ET, etc., and then in relation to the eligibility criteria for the Skipton Fund, there's reference to proposals to amending that needing to be agreed by all UK health ministers and so on. If we then go to the bottom of the next page, I should say there's a box that sets out, or a table that sets out estimated one-off and recurrent cost implications. And then if we pick it up in paragraph 4, Finance advise that reaching agreement both within DH and with Treasury and the devolved administrations over any financial implications will be challenging. As announced at the pre-budget report, Treasury will allocate £5 billion in additional efficiency savings across departments in the budget in order to reduce public expenditure, and so on. And then over the next page, so there's reference in the top that the Treasury will not provide any additional funding. And then 5, you asked whether additional funding for the financial relief schemes could be paid in instalments to ease the burden on central budgets. However, finance colleagues advise against this. And then the heading support for the Hemophilia Society, I'm not going to read, but we can see, if we just look at the whole page, and then the next page, there are a number of handwritten observations on this. And then if we go to page 8, under the heading Summary, paragraph 25 says, we welcome your views on the above, in particular, and then a number of matters set out, including proposals for increased funding to MFT and ET, and then writing to the devolved administration seeking views on proposal to amend the eligibility criteria for the Skipton Fund. Now, you say in your witness statement, and we'll go back to that, WITN 5494001, page 76, you say this in paragraph 3.126, I was unhappy with this submission and through my locum APS asked for a further submission to be provided. I was concerned that its focus was too much on pointing out the difficulties in my preferred approach. And then you've set out the text, which I think we can, rather than going to the document, we can take it from your statement, of the communication from your locum APS. So it says the Minister's objectives are as follows: a set of proposals that she can present to Secretary of State as to what we can do to respond to the inquiry's recommendations. These proposals will need to give options of how to approach each recommendation. And then the next two bullet points deal with matters relating to the Hemophilia Society. If we go down to the bottom of the page, it says what the Minister would really like are options on how to respond to the Archer inquiry in the most positive way possible. She would like to see a submission which responds to her steers and sets out the options she prefers and how they might be achieved alongside the pros and cons. However, she would also like to see further options which might also provide a robust response to Lord Archer's recommendations. Can you just perhaps unpick for us what you were driving at here?
It is the job of civil servants to make sure that ministers, and it's perfectly legitimate, understand the consequences of any decisions they might want to take and to highlight those problems so that the minister is aware. But I also was trying to find a way to respond to the Lord Archer inquiry recommendations as positively as I could in the circumstances, financial and otherwise, that I was in at that point, not as the last word, but as a way of indicating that the government valued the Archer report and understood what was being said to it. And so where I'm putting forward what I think needs to be looked at, but there may be other options that I hadn't thought of, and so that last sentence, she would also like to see further options which might also provide a robust response. Robust means positive. It may not be immediate, we might not be immediately able to respond, but that it would demonstrate a way forward. That is what I was seeking to achieve, but you can see that I'm in quite severe time constraints now because from the publication of the Archer report, and there's still a lot of work being done behind the scenes, and quite rightly everybody expected a response. And I was under parliamentary pressure, and you can see that.
So you got a further set of advice on the 17th of April 2009, WITN 5494052. We can see from the first paragraph, it sets out Ms Woodson, who has authored this, her understanding that you were keen to respond to Lord Archer's report in the most positive way possible. And then each of Lord Archer's recommendations is summarised, and there are various options then discussed in relation to them. So we've got the issue relating to haemophilia on the first page. If we go over the page, I'm not going to look at any particular point in this, but we can see again the various recommendations summarised and then some advice in relation to each. If we go to the third page, we get to the perhaps most difficult issue of financial support. So we've got recommendation 6A, and this is Lord Archer's recommendation that financial assistance should be increased and take the form of prescribed periodic payments. Skipton Fund, you've already decided this should be left alone at present, but that we should make a commitment to review the fund in 2014. And then the reference in paragraph 18 to the Macfarlane Trust and Eileen Trusts. And then there are options. Option 1, to give the recipients of the Macfarlane and Eileen Trust payments of £10,000 per year, and option 2 is to give a payment of £12,800 per year. And it said that these suggested increases in per annum funding are relatively small. Finance advised that finding the additional funding would be difficult given the more challenging financial climate the department is facing, but it should be possible through reprioritisation, and then their preference is for option 1, which was the cheaper option. And then 6B, anomalies between and within the schemes should be removed. We understand you would like to see harmonisation of eligibility within the Skipton Fund, and then the most significant anomaly is set out in paragraph 22, which was that partners and dependents of those who died before it was set up do not receive any payments. The pros, this is by far the most significant anomaly, correcting it would be welcomed. Cons, it's a very large sum and reaching agreement with HMT and DAs would be challenging. Finance colleagues advise that it's not impossible, but that you would need to make a strong case to Secretary of State. Secretary of State would need to be convinced as to why this should be funded over and above other pressing priorities. And then if we go to a document from your private secretary at WITN 5494054, Morgan Smith is writing to you, says these responses to the recommendations seem much more robust and better incorporate your preferences. And then the position summarised by Morgan Smith, and we can see, I think that's your handwriting saying agreed. If we go over the page, we see option 6A, so that was the increase in periodic payments for Macfarlane and Eileen Trust. And you put option 2 question mark. At least I think that's what that says. And then if we go over to the next page in relation to recommendation 6B, where it says this is the most difficult recommendation as it potentially involves 54 million. I think this is your writing. Are there any other anomalies we could deal with? And then bottom of the page, bottom right hand corner, just need clarification on 6A option 2, which I think is best. 6B, not really straightforward, let's talk about it. So as I understand that, in relation to the Skipton Fund issue, you wanted to have further conversations, but it was seen as something that might be difficult to achieve. In relation to the increase in payments to the Macfarlane by the Macfarlane and Eileen Trust, you favoured option 2, which was the higher of the two suggested increases, taking the payments to 12,800 per annum.
That's correct.
Now, if we then just pick it up at WITN 5494055, I think.
Could I just say that
Yes.
You'll see my notes on, I think it's 6B.
Yeah. Can we just go back to the previous document?
It says, are there any other anomalies, given how expensive I'm being told, how difficult that one might to correct that one? What I'm looking for is I'm looking for movement that I I didn't consider at the time that doing nothing at all was an option, even if it was a small bit of progress, not progress that might be welcomed or accepted by the infected and those affected. But at least I was trying to create movement. So that's why that comment is there. And I think it sort of continues to illustrate that I wanted to take the Archer report and move forward, not draw a line again.
And then we can see by the 23rd of April 2009, you are then putting options to Mr Johnson as Secretary of State. And that's the document we have on screen. It's from you to the Secretary of State. And the second paragraph says, I've been exploring Lord Archer's recommendations in detail with officials. I would like to respond positively as far as possible, whilst recognising that some of the recommendations are simply unaffordable, particularly at the present time. And then we can see the number of recommendations there, or suggested responses set out. Again, I'm not going to go through the detail of most of them, but if we go over the page, we can just pick up the position in relation to the financial payments. That we leave the payments under the Skipton Fund for those infected with hepatitis C the same as they are now, but announce we will review this in 2014. That we change the scheme of payments made by the Macfarlane and Eileen trusts to those infected with HIV to remove the discretionary element and give all recipients the same amount every year, and that we double the current average annual amount from 6,400 to 12,800. Third bullet point, that we do not rectify any of the anomalies within and between the schemes. To rectify the main anomaly in the Skipton Fund would cost up to £54 million, and even to harmonise the lump sum payments between the two other trusts would cost £19 million. And then there's a reference to continued discussions with the Association of British Insurers and a further look-back exercise. So in relation to that issue of 6B, it looks like you haven't found any other way of dealing with the position regarding the Skipton Fund, other than the review in 2014.
That's correct. Yes, I hadn't. I do pick that up, though, post-ministerial.
Yes.
We'll come to that.
Yeah, we'll come to that. It then says, this package of measures will not satisfy Lord Archer or his supporters entirely. In particular, we're likely to face severe criticism from the hepatitis C community, as we'll not be making any changes to the Skipton Fund. And is it right to understand, Baroness, that the sole reason why that was not being addressed was financial? It was the cost of it.
Yes.
And then if we go back to the first page, I understand this to be Mr Johnson's endorsement in handwriting at the top, agreed, good outcome, if not all, that Lord Archer would want. So if we then, just in terms of the chronology, go to DHSC 00412119_124. This is a media handling plan. This is dated the 18th of May. And it's a proposed handling plan to accompany the government's publication of its response to the Archer inquiry. And I think we can see at the bottom of the page, under the heading Media Handling, the last paragraph, it says, many of the individuals affected by contaminated blood and blood products believe that insufficient action has been taken by successive governments. In responding to the Archer inquiry, Press Office recommends that you, Dawn Primarolo, agree to accept carefully chosen interviews if necessary. This will help show that this is a serious issue that's been carefully considered. Do you know whether you did do any interviews?
I didn't do any interviews, no.
And do you know why that was the case?
I think there was one from memory, which was a face-to-face interview, and it was on Newsnight, and I didn't do that interview. I can't quite remember why, but on reflection, with hindsight, it might have been better had I, but I didn't. But that was, as I recall, the one interview. I'm not sure that's. I would have to see the record to see. Okay.
And then over the page, under the heading Risks and Considerations, it refers to the increased payment of 12,800, but then anticipates the likely substantial criticism that was expected. The system for providing financial relief for individuals infected with hepatitis C will not be looked at for another 5 years. While payments for those with HIV will rise to 12,800, this falls short of countries such as the Republic of Ireland, where liability has been admitted, and is still a small amount for a lifetime of suffering. And do you agree with that characterisation, that although there is an increased sum, it was still a small amount for a lifetime of suffering?
I think I have to agree with that, yes. It was the best I could manage at the time. I did my best. But I don't think anybody could look at that, frankly, and think that that should be the last word. And I didn't intend it to be the last word. So if it was the only thing that was done, then it wouldn't have been enough, no. And I think the record shows I then acted to try and bring forward more response.
In terms of the issue of an apology, what I think was forthcoming was an expression of sympathy which you've set out the text of in your statement. So if we could go back to that WITN 5494001 and go to page 87. So paragraph 3.140 refers to the written ministerial statement and the government's full response to the Archer inquiry. I'm not going to take time going through those. And then paragraph 3.141 refers to the press release and says this: the press release included the statement from me that I would like to offer my deepest sympathy to all those who suffered in this tragic episode. Sadly, it was not possible to effectively test for these viruses in the 1970s and early 80s, and we deeply regret that these events occurred following NHS treatment. And then the next paragraph looks at steps taken, and the third paragraph looks at financial help. And then you say this: the first paragraph was sincerely meant and was given following the advice I had received, but it fell short of the fuller kind of apology I had instinctively wanted to give.
Yes, that's correct. The advice from the department, both legal and otherwise, was that as Minister of State, that was as far as I could go, and I took that advice because they're the experts.
Now, there was indeed a negative reaction to the government's response to the Archer inquiry. We can see it by way of example from the letter from Lord Archer himself at DHSC 00/41219_095. In which Lord Archer wrote to you on the 29th of May in response to a letter you'd written to him. And then it says this in the third paragraph: while some of the government's proposals were frankly disappointing, for example, the absence of any increase in financial relief for beneficiaries of the Skipton Fund until 2014, the indifference to the limitations in the entitlement of widows, and the suggestion that after 5 years the Hemophilia Society will be expected to have in place an effective strategy to meet its future funding plans as though it were a commercial enterprise. Some of the proposals are more positive, and I would have hoped that they could have been presented in a more positive setting. And then he refers to a hope that there will be further discussions between the various parties in a less emotive and confrontational atmosphere. There were other responses, in particular, I think, from the Hemophilia Society in strong terms to it. You then called a meeting on the 21st of May. The document that refers to this meeting, I'll read out the URN, the reference number, but I'm actually going to look at the document by reference to your statement, so we don't need to put this on screen, Lawrence. It's DHSC 5585213, but it's actually easier to read from your statement. So if we go back to the witness statement, please, WITN 5494001, and go to page 89. You say this at the bottom of the page. In some ways, the negative reaction to the government's response to Lord Archer's report was helpful because it gave me a lever to try to see if more could be done. Accordingly, I called a meeting on the 21st of May to discuss what could be done and how to respond to the negative reaction. A note following this meeting from my APS shows the sorts of points which I'd raised and which we were discussing. The note included, what can we do regarding the Skipton Fund? Can we announce review? Does that mean bringing forward the date from 2014 to earlier?
It does, yes.
Can we give more money? We need to know what recipients' costs are and how the two payments reflect the cost the recipients have. Why did we choose these amounts at the time? Do they reflect real costs of recipients? What amounts would reflect the real costs? Can we look at cases where dependents have suffered severely and perhaps give them some funding? Can we cost out the second stage payment group if the money there can be increased? Then there's a reference to a proposal for an official to speak to the Hemophilia Society. The next bullet point deals with a document still withheld under Freedom of Information, the document regarding Kenneth Clark. And then this bullet point, MSPH asked why we haven't accepted liability as Ireland have and asked for this to be investigated. She said that we need to separate ourselves from the comparison with Ireland in order to get a positive message across. People need to understand why the UK case is different to Ireland. Now, it looks as though you might be saying two different things there, Baroness, and I wondered whether you can help. The first seems to be suggesting that there should be investigation as to whether the UK's position should be closer aligned to Ireland's in terms of acceptance of liability. And then it seems to be suggesting that should get a message across that the position is different. Can you help us with that?
Yes, I think that's the same point. Firstly, we need a clearer position than I felt I had on why Ireland had apparently taken a different route. And once we had achieved that, if you like, clear explanation, we being the government, the department, then explaining why the UK was different would flow from that. So I was trying to get back to this point of, well, what is the difference between Ireland, the scheme that the Republic of Ireland agreed, compared to the route that the UK government took?
And I think you've referred to it in your statement, that there was a subsequent successful judicial review challenge, yes, which looked at this issue and the department's understanding of the issue.
I think that was after I'd
That was
left the
after you'd
department.
left
But
the
yes,
department.
I do accept that, yes, of course.
And then the last two bullet points in italics on the screen, MSPH said if it transpired that money needed to go to the Skipton Fund, then we would need to revisit this with finance colleagues. Judith noted that we have to be mindful that by waiting until 2014 to review, it may look like we are waiting for more recipients to die before reviewing the money being given. And then there's a reference to trying to cost out the position if there was to be a rectification of the anomaly between the Skipton Fund and the Macfarlane and Eileen recipients. And then this, MSPH stated that she was uncomfortable with a monetary argument versus a moral argument. Can you help us with that?
Yes, I think firstly, it's absolutely clear from my statements that the finances were constrained if the department had to find it from its own resources. But that should not stop either myself as the minister, assisted by the department, in trying to find a way through that. The time constraints between Lord Archer's report and needing to have a government response made it more difficult. With more time, would we be able to find a way through? And of course, the question of, for me, the moral argument was that I wanted to ensure that we did the right thing for the infected and affected. And that stood separately from the question of finding the money, although, of course, it's much more complex than that. They cross over all the time. So that is not very clearly stated by me. But again, this is the day after the written ministerial statement, I think, wasn't it? The 20th.
It's the 21st.
This is the 21st. Was the ministerial statement the 20th?
Yeah. I'm going to have to check that. Yes, it was the 20th.
So what I'm trying to do is move it on. I'm trying not to leave it where it is. And I suppose this reflects my continuing desire. Objective is a better word, actually, not desire. My continuing objective to find the best possible solution within all the constraints that, of course, exist for a minister and a department. I do reflect on that at the end in my section 5. It's almost an impossible equation to settle.
Now, after that meeting on the 21st of May, you received a further submission on the 1st of June. I'm not going to go to that. Your Assistant Private Secretary again asked for more information, more to be added, particularly in relation to the situation in Ireland and Skipton Fund options. And the upshot then was a revised submission on the 2nd of June, which is at WITN 5494101. So it's Rowena G. Cock 2U, 2nd of June 2009. And paragraph 2, halfway down the page, says, you've asked us for more detailed information as to why the situation here is different from Ireland, together with possible options for handling the criticism around the Skipton Fund. There's then a passage setting out why it said Ireland is different. And again, we see the assertion that people were offered the best treatment available at the time, and that as soon as blood screening tests were available, they were implemented, and so on. And then if we go over the page, the position in relation to Ireland is there set out. I'm not going to read it aloud. And then in terms of Skipton Fund, the paragraph 6 refers to your concern that there needs to be a review of the fund now. And then it said that that's a risky strategy. And then if we go to the next page, there are then options for increasing Skipton Fund payments. Again, I don't propose to read through the detail of them. There are a range of options there set out. If we go over to the next page, please. And paragraph 10 records the issue on which most criticism is received, namely that families and dependents of those who died before August 2003 don't benefit. And then paragraph 11, any increased funding we were to announce is of course likely to be criticised as insufficient. And then there are a range of other matters then set out. If we just go 2 pages further on to the conclusion, paragraphs 22 and 23, we see again in the second sentence the assertion that it remains the case people were given the treatment that was considered to be the best available at the time. However much we would like to, one would like to increase the financial assistance offered to them on humanitarian grounds. We have real concerns about affordability given the current financial situation. We therefore recommend holding the line you've already decided and announced re the Skipton Fund. If, however, you feel this position is untenable, then we would advise against making any public announcement about a review for the reasons set out above. It would be preferable to continue discussing options for increasing funding internally and seeking agreement with the Secretary of State and HMT if you wish to pursue this. Now that's the 2nd of June 2009. As I understand the position from your statement, Baroness, and from the documents, you never dealt with this submission because you then left office and you moved to a different ministerial position. Is that right? So this was left for your successor?
Yes, I think that's the case, yes.
And you say in your statement, I don't think we need to have it up on screen, but it's paragraphs 3.155 to 3.157. You say, to the best of your recollection, you wouldn't have been able to engage with the substance of the submission before leaving the department. You'd have been involved in the run-up to the local and European elections, and immediately thereafter the reshuffle ensued. And so you can't be confident you even saw that submission, is my understanding.
I'm afraid I can't be confident, no, that I saw it.
So I know the time. I've got about 10 more minutes of questions for Baroness Primarolo. So I'm in your hands and indeed the witnesses as to whether I complete that now or whether we...
Well, let me ask the Baroness. The position is this, that when Council has finished her questions, an opportunity is given to those who are core participants to ask questions of you through their recognised legal representatives through Council. So she has to field those questions, and plainly, they won't necessarily have been formulated because those who may want to ask you questions, the questions may arise out of what you've been saying this morning. That normally takes some time, maybe half an hour or so to field those questions. So the option is either we break now till 2 o'clock, come back for 10 minutes, have a break of about half an hour or so. I can't say exactly how long it'll be, but it'll be about that length, and then come back for the questions from core participants. Or we can go on for 10 minutes now. During the break, or slightly longer break, the Council will field those questions and it will be quicker overall. But you may want a break, that's fine. If you don't, if you're happy to continue, let's continue. What would you like to do?
I think it would make sense, Sir Brian, to continue with this line of questioning and then break, as you say, and wait accordingly for any further questions. I'm happy, of course I'm happy to do that, but I'll do what is most convenient. I mean, those who are sitting here in the inquiry may prefer a break now as opposed to waiting a little longer, so I'm in your hands.
Well, let's continue for the 10 minutes or so, and I see people are nodding, so that's
okay.
Confirmation.
Okay.
So the issue I just want to explore with you finally, Baroness, is to go back to this question of a public inquiry. And I've got a handful of matters I want to explore and then just look at what you say at the end of your statement on this issue. You've told us in your evidence and indeed in your written statement that one of the issues that seemed to you most significant in maintaining the line that there should be no public inquiry was what you were being told about there having been no wrongful practices employed, and hence the threshold criteria, whatever they might be for a public inquiry, not being surmounted. Now, the point I wanted to explore with you is the extent to which that kind of conclusion that there's no wrongful practices in a case such as this can be reached without any engagement with the victims, those who've been infected or affected, because you were being told no wrongful practices, you were being told best available treatment at the time. But had there been engagement with those who had been infected and their families, it is likely that the department would have heard things similar to what this inquiry's heard. Lack of consent, informed consent, lack of information, lack of alternative treatment options, and so on. So the issue I want to explore with you really is whether it was safe and sensible for the department to reach the view that there shouldn't be a public inquiry without having sat down and listened to what the victims, those who had been infected, might have to say about whether they thought there were wrongful practices. Do you have any observations on that?
Ms. Richards, I find it very difficult to talk on behalf of the department. I'm trying to explain what I was doing and my objectives. And from my own point of view, I think with this whole sort of question around whether evidence should have been given to the Archer inquiry, Minister's gone, even though I wasn't ever asked, but and it didn't come up in correspondence, I found out. But personally, I feel now with hindsight, which may not be necessarily comforting to others, is that if I had gone to the Archer inquiry to at least explain what I've tried to explain here, that might have changed my view on the issues. Whether there would have been a public inquiry is another thing, because it wasn't down to me. Because what I think I can see is that I'm gradually, over time, getting more information. So I do raise in my paragraph the section 5, this point of the department at which the criticism is levelled supplying the information, and whether there needs to be another mechanism. What I sought to do is to get all the information out there, but it was a huge amount. So the answer to your question is, it seems a very reasonable proposition, but I can't answer whether I don't know whether they ever spoke to people who were infected or affected, and whether it would have changed their view. Their view was exactly as expressed, about time, about officials still being, that had elapsed, officials being in the department who were directly connected with it at the time. So that is a difficult question for me to answer without total speculation.
Can I then just look at one final document before we look at the last section of your statement, the one final contemporaneous document from your time in office? It's DHSC 6548432. This is an MP, John Randall MP, writing to you on the 19th of July 2007, and there's obviously been earlier correspondence. And then he says, I've heard again from the Hemophilia Society, and I enclose here with a copy of the correspondence I've received from Mr. Chris James, the Chief Executive. I would very much appreciate your comments on the points he's raised. And then if we go over the page, there's a letter from the Chief Executive to Mr. Randall. It says in the second paragraph, the Minister's response is a standard one, essentially repeating the line that the government has held for over 2 decades. Unfortunately, this response raises more questions than it answers. Please could you write back to the Minister to ask the following questions. Why she is certain that the contaminated blood disaster could not have been prevented when no investigation has been carried out into its cause? How can the 4,670 people infected with deadly viruses be confident that lessons have been learnt when there's been no government-backed inquiry to discover whether swifter action could have been taken to secure the safety of the blood supply? Why has the government only reviewed documents relating to non-A, non-B hepatitis between the periods 1970 to 1985? This limited remit excludes HIV and does not explore the crucial period of 1985 to 1991. I enclose a briefing which explains that the government missed several opportunities to improve the safety of the blood supply. The haemophilia community is concerned that unless there's a full official public inquiry, the lessons of these past failures will not be learnt. And then if we go to the next page, the attached document is a summary of the Haemophilia Society's submission to the Archer inquiry, and we can pick it up halfway down the page. Just above the bold print of we've identified 7 specific failures. It says the Haemophilia Society believes that many of these infections were preventable and has presented evidence which shows a catalogue of mistakes and delays by both the government and the NHS. We've identified 7 specific failures. And then the first is the failure to pursue self-sufficiency. 2, the failure to introduce a surrogate test for non-A, non-B hepatitis. 3, the failure to restrict the use of clotting factor in less urgent cases once the risks of HIV and hepatitis C infection became known. Rather than being a life-saving treatment, clotting factor was continued to be used as a precaution to prevent bleeds occurring and to treat people with mild haemophilia. 4, delays in introducing HIV screening, both of blood products and donors. 5, delays in introducing the heat treatment of blood products. 6, delays in informing patients of their viruses. And then 7, delays in introducing hepatitis C screening. Now, I'm not inviting you to accept that each of those criticisms or suggested failures is correct. But this is it being drawn to your attention that there is another side to the story. So whereas the department is saying no wrongful practices, etc., others are saying actually there are things that went wrong and things that should have been done differently. Do you know whether these issues were investigated or whether you asked for them to be investigated?
Mr. Richard, I have to admit here to a failure on my part, which is that in all the correspondence that I was receiving, sometimes all the background papers would be included and sometimes they wouldn't. And I didn't always read under, it sounds like I'm making excuses for myself, I will withdraw that. I didn't always read the background because I was entitled to expect that a letter replying would do exactly that on my behalf. So the point made in the support letters that were with John Randall's letter, I don't recall, even when I was prompted by the evidence, that I actually saw that. Now that may, as I said, a failure on my part, but it's not always possible to read on correspondence or the back papers. But that's, as I said, that's not an excuse, that's a failure on my part, and I accept the proposition that you're putting about those 7 points, but I think I would be entitled to expect the department to have taken note of that.
And it's right to point out that we know that there was a response from you back to Mr. Randall, but that letter hasn't been found. And then there is a further letter from Chris James of the Haemophilia Society to Mr. Randall. That's how we know there's another letter from you, because it refers to a letter from you dated the 15th of August. And Mr. Randall passes that on to you. I'm just going to read the reference rather than go to it. It's DHSC 65-48458. And you've said in your statement that there should have been a reply from you again to Mr. Randall, but again, that document hasn't been found. Can I then just finally take you to some of the observations about public inquiries in the end of your statement? So if we could have Baroness Primarolo's statement back up on screen. WITN 5494001. If we just pick it up at page 109. So there's a section of your statement here headed the decision on whether to have a public inquiry. I'm not going to read through this in its entirety. I just want to pick up in terms of observations really for the future, what you say in a handful of these paragraphs. So at paragraph 5.14 on the next page, you say this at 5.14, the central difficulty which I would identify was that as the Minister, I was caught between arguments which were said to justify a public inquiry and my department's rebuttal of those arguments without, as it seems to me now, an adequate tool and means to identify objectively whether the threshold for calling a public inquiry was met. And then in paragraph 5.16, you explain in the bottom half of paragraph 5.16, picking it up about 6 lines down, but I was aware that a significant but somewhat ill-defined threshold had to be met before agreeing to a public inquiry. What I needed to convince me of the need for a public inquiry was a basis to conclude that there had been some kind of wrongdoing or significant failure to act by previous governments, which was of a scale requiring the much fuller investigation of public inquiry. However, it was hard to assess objectively whether the threshold had been met. While there was criticism of the ongoing handling by the current and recent governments, the events were principally historic, dating back to the 1970s and 1980s, and they were complex. The allegations of shortcomings in how previous governments have responded were significant, but the Department of Health had by this stage published its own reports, which were not suggestive of wrongdoing or failures of the kind that would justify a public inquiry. Hence, certainly in the terms of the advice I was receiving, the tenor was that allegations of wrongdoing and serious failures were not borne out by the records which the department had reviewed and reported upon. And then you say this, looking at it now, however, internal department reports were never likely to assuage the concerns of the infected and affected. It causes me to reflect on whether, when those reports were first commissioned, we may have been better off commissioning some kind of independent initial review to judge whether a full inquiry was justified. And then if we go over to page 113, just want to pick up then, bottom of the page, you were referred to what Mr. Burnham said in a House of Commons debate in January 2015. And you say at the bottom, I'm a little reluctant to go too far down the line of giving my opinion on someone else's opinion. That said, I do recognise Andy Burnham's concern, and to some extent I share it. I would not myself express this in terms of resistance, but I do recognise an element of institutional inertia. That was something I did experience when I tried to press the case for a more positive response to Lord Archer's report. And then you go on to talk about how you did work with people who were good and of the highest calibre, and so on. And then you say, nevertheless, in my experience, it can be hard to move the civil service away from established lines to take, and a very cautious approach to setting precedents that will cause difficulties or significant expenditure. But it's also my experience that they're working hard in the public interest, and that it's a legitimate part of their job to warn ministers of the spending and precedent-setting implications of proposed courses of action. Added to the complexity is the conventional caution about the civil service addressing policy issues that were before previous administrations. And then in paragraph 5.24, you say this, I'm not able to, nor do I feel it's my role to offer solutions or recommendations, but reflecting on these events, I question whether the whole model needs to be reviewed. It was certainly not ideal to be expected to make the judgment on whether to have a public inquiry into historical events, as the Minister for the Department said to have been most involved in the past, whose officials had conducted their own internal reports which had not supported the need for an inquiry. In some cases, there may be a role for external assessment by an independent review to help to decide whether a full public inquiry is commissioned, but I recognise that there are difficulties and that this may be seen to delegate a decision for which the responsibility lies with the government. I just wanted to read those out and then very briefly pick out 3 points to ensure correctly understood them. In relation to the question of public inquiry, as I understand this part of your statement, you are recognising the difficulty that may arise if, as a minister looking at this issue, you are dependent only on the information being provided to you by the department who might be subject to criticism. Hence, you raise the possibility of having some kind of either independent initial review or a possibility of some form of external assessment. Is that right? That's one of the points that you're seeking to make in this part of your statement.
Yes, that's correct. This is with hindsight
Yes,
and
understood.
how it looks, and making sure that everything's public. It seems to me there could be an issue there. Yes.
The second point was this identification of what I think Mr. Burnham had talked about, resistance from civil servants. You put in a slightly different way. You talk about an element of institutional inertia, exemplified by the what we've looked at in terms of the exchanges between you and officials in relation to response to the Archer inquiry.
Yes, I think my feeling with hindsight is that the officials, for all the reasons that they had given, it happened before they were there, they'd been to inquiries internally, all the evidence had been put in the public domain that they had, that somehow that was the matter had been dealt with. And that's what, and therefore me wanting to reopen many of the considerations, they have to have one eye on, yes, making sure that I get the information I need and that it's public as we had requested. But secondly, they are looking now and for the future, what are the best decisions for the department to take. So I think, there is, even though ministers take policy decisions, there is potentially an inertia. This is closed. Why does she require me to reopen it?
And then the third point that seems to be expressed in these paragraphs is this issue of access to the advice of given to previous administrations. And we've discussed your wish to try and speak to former ministers and the extent to which you were able to progress that suggestion. But do you think this is a sensible convention that somehow prevents new ministers from knowing what was said to ministers of a different administration?
Despite the fact that I was asking to speak to ministers, I think the convention is sensible because it, for ministers directly to reach across different administrations, it could potentially be open to some misleading, abuse, whatever, of what was decided at the time. And that is why I took the view that, if you like, some intermediate stage should be taken to protect that convention, but to ensure that all the documents had been properly scrutinised and that the statements could be made. I don't believe, even now, having seen all of this and gone through it again with all the evidence, that the officials were motivated for the wrong reasons. That they believed what they were telling me, and I think somebody else independently, we might have benefited if it had been considered. But I recognise that calling public inquiries is a very particular and important procedure, and that it's important that the government is held to account. And therefore, I'm not sure whether this would cut across it, and that's why I put the caveat in. It's not my role to say what the solutions are. Whether there's another solution to crossing that, maybe there isn't. But that's what I was suggesting there.
Thank you. So I'm sorry, I was longer than 10 minutes. Apologies to everyone waiting for their lunch.
Just a little.
I have now finished my questions, subject to suggestions from core participants and so on.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now until at least 2:30. It gives us the hour for lunch. I say at least because it may be that councillor needs more time to deal with questions which arise, you'll be told if that's the case. So not before 2:30, but otherwise, if there is enough time, 2:30.
Thank you,
So
sir.
not before 2:30.